Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's New Normal webinar here at Nutter. I'm Bill Kennedy, the host of this webinar, and our special guest today is Attorney General Maura Healey. This is a series that the firm created during COVID-19, and we've had a number of webinars, and we have several scheduled, and I'll refer to those in a moment. But I want to thank the Attorney General for being with us today, and I want to thank all of you for taking time in your day to join us. And on behalf of Nutter, I want to send my best wishes to you all, and hope that you and your families are safe and well during this unprecedented health crisis. Certainly, we're all adjusting in some way to the lifestyle that we've had since March. Next week, we do have a webinar with Secretary Mike Keneally, the Secretary of Economic Affairs and the co-chair of the Governor's Reopening Advisory Board. That's next Wednesday, the 27th at 1. And then the following, then we're scheduling a conversation with Professor Nick Burns of Harvard Kennedy School, and he's going to speak about world politics and the impact of COVID-19 on foreign affairs and the impact of the presidential election and so forth on foreign affairs. And third, Paul Ayub and others are planning a transportation webinar to talk about the importance of our transportation system to get the economy returning. So I hope you'll be able to join us for those. Again, I want to welcome Attorney General Maura Healey. Welcome, Madam General, and thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Bill, and the team at Nutter, and greetings to everyone on the line. I look forward to questions and a conversation. And, I just want to say at the outset that I think that we have learned a lot. We will continue to learn as we move forward. I think that it has been remarkable the way that our hospitals have pulled together every morning. And I'm on a call with the governor and Secretary Sutters and heads of all the major hospital systems in the state. And to see them collaborate and work together in ways they've never done before has been truly remarkable. And I think that the numbers here would be so much worse were it not for the way that they have all pulled together and worked really hard. I'm also struck by the fact that this has exposed some real fragilities in our system. We are seeing an incredible number of complaints for unemployment, problems with accessing PPE if you're a small business here, concerns about childcare. Certainly my office, and you've heard me talk a lot about the disparities, both in the infection rates and devastation specific to Black and Brown communities. It's not specific to Massachusetts. We're seeing that around the country, but it really has, I think, laid bare in a stark way, some of those real inequities. And my final point is that I think this does provide an opportunity to build anew. I don't talk about rebuilding. I talk about building, because I think that this actually is, and perhaps the silver lining is the fact that this gives us an opportunity to rethink and build new ways of both how we vote. As you know, I've supported vote by mail for the primary and the general. I think that's really important as a matter of public health. How we access healthcare. Think about our transportation system. I mean, we all are experiencing now, the absence of a high volume of cars on the road, and given the extent to which transportation really is the driving force behind so much of the greenhouse gas emissions. We've been talking as a state and as a business community about transportation for a long time now, and I hope this gives us an opportunity to really build in a different way. There's going to be revenue shortfalls. There's a lot of heartache still to come. My heart goes out to the families who've lost loved ones to this crisis. I think at this point we all know someone, who's been personally affected. I've had no less than 6 people in my office lose parents, many in nursing homes through this pandemic. So I do want to express my sympathies to all out there, and very much, know that I view this as a long haul proposition, and we're going to have to find ways to continue to collaborate and work together.
Well, thank you for that. I think that spirit of collaboration and that is being demonstrated by so many people. I think we all hope that will continue. Thank you for that opening. And I know during our conversation, if it's okay, I'm going to drill down on a few of those, if that's all right. And my first question really is, when the governor declared a state of emergency, did you, as the Attorney General, take any particular action within your office in anticipation of the effects or the impacts from the virus? I know that day, the state of emergency, March 10th, unprecedented. We didn't know much about the virus then, but how did you anticipate how your office would be engaged? For instance, did you restructure any of the departments in your office? Re-establish any priorities? Reallocate resources? Any new strategies? Could you give us a sort of an inside? I didn't know about that daily call you have. So can you tell us about what you may have done internally to respond or to anticipate the issues that might come up?
Yeah. Well, we moved pretty quickly, and I'm really grateful to my I team and operations team. We moved the entire office, 600 people, 4 offices around the state, to remote immediately. We went remote before the state actually went remote, and that helped us because we could test out some of the kinks with things. So everybody was working remotely. Right from the very beginning. We had a few people coming in to check the mail, but really, other than some people needing to come in for court files, because of course hearings have continued, we have been working remotely and working well. It was really important to me that we swing extra resources into hotlines. We anticipated that we were going to get a bunch of calls. We didn't know if they would be healthcare related or fair labor related, but we just knew that we had to be there on the end of the line, ready to answer people's calls. So we shifted resources there. And we convened a COVID-19 team. And from the beginning, we have been talking twice weekly. In between, we have action items that everybody's working on. In the early days, we had to think about how first of all, it was getting the technology, making sure that everybody was set up so that they had laptops, cell phones connected to the hotline. So again, people could be there to answer the phone, train people on Microsoft Teams and WebEx. But then we quickly set about the substantive work. So the COVID-19 team, within like the first week, we had issued emergency regulations to protect consumers as well as hospitals from price gouging, to end debt collection for the time being, to do things like, make sure that we were working with the utilities so that there were no shutoffs occurring during this time. My community engagement division, which I set up when I started as Attorney General, has really been so beneficial because they're the ones who are out there regularly engaging with vulnerable communities, immigrant communities, communities of color. So over the last 10 weeks, we have done multiple virtual trainings, Zooms, webinars in multiple languages. I'm lucky I have a staff where, we've got a number of languages represented, and they're doing direct Zooms, and webinars with the communities to talk to them about their rights and to do things like, encourage messaging around, getting to the hospital, because we thought that people weren't going to the hospital even when they had, signs of stroke or heart attack. So those are some of the things we did. We created a COVID page on our website that we've updated regularly with information about, landlord tenant issues, all the way to a really substantial page on small businesses, advising them how to renegotiate rent and the like, as well as accessing different programs. And we've really tried to make sure that everybody across the office was focused on how they could, use their resources to fight this epidemic. So, that's what we've done. A COVID team, no new personnel, but just reestablishing priorities, reallocating some resources, so that we were, quick to act on a lot of things.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk more about some of the priorities and what we've encountered, but that's the way we went about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I've used this phrase before, but the whole pandemic is kind of like we're flying the airplane while we're trying to fix it. So many questions and things that might come up and issues, and then the health, the science and the health questions at the same time. To be able to respond like that is very good. So thank you very much for that, and thanks to your office for responding that way. The next question is, in some way, we all know about the different divisions within the AG's office. You refer to your office as the People's Law Firm, and I had an opportunity to look. I know many folks may not use this anymore, but I still use the Lawyer's Diary. For 40 years, I've had that book, and I looked at all the bureaus that you have: criminal, energy, government, healthcare, public protection. As you look at the various bureaus and divisions, they all have subdivisions within the AG's office. Could you please describe and discuss the impact that COVID-19 has had and continues to have on the kind of matters being handled, addressed, or investigated by your office to the extent you can? Has the volume of calls and complaints increased, and of course the nature of the matters? So I know you've introduced it, but essentially, what are the types of matters that the AG's office is responding to and acting upon that have been created by COVID-19?
Yeah, no, it's a great
question. That's a broad
question.
Thank you.
No, but let me start by talking about the work of the different divisions in this time, and then I'll probably give you a little bit of, my specific, where I put personal time in, which is a little different from some of the traditional work of the AG's office and different from what the divisions are doing. But, here's what my teams are working on. We see, first off, we see immediately a lot of scams. Obviously, there are people out there looking to take advantage of the anxiety, the fear, and trying to exploit people who are vulnerable. So we've been active, shutting down websites that were offering coronavirus treatments or vaccines or special vitamins that people could take. And, that's run the gamut from just making phone calls to issuing cease and desist orders. We've also seen people who are calling up people pretending to be there from the government to help them access loans and funding. This is for just individuals, but also for small businesses. So we've had to warn about that. We've seen a number of event cancellations. Most of our consumer complaints have been about concert cancellations, season ticket cancellations, event trip cancellations, and a ton of student trip cancellations. So we hope to be out later today with a resolution against EF, which is a really large travel provider and student, travel provider. But that was a big issue. I'd say to people, if you're having trouble with getting refunds, get in touch with our office. We worked very closely with Boston Sports Club, got thousands of complaints against Boston Sports Club. And, I got on the phone with the CEO, who's a kid from Foxborough, actually. His folks still live here. And I said, you got to make this right. They completely blew it as a company in terms of how they handled this. But we ended up working out a deal where, people were able to cancel or freeze their membership at no charge. And then, they've agreed to work directly with us to get refunds for anyone who, was charged after March 16th. Evictions, we get a lot of calls from people. We people with landlords who were threatening to evict them, spending time, literally, we've gone through the housing docket every day to make sure that no unlawful evictions are going through. We recognize it's hard for landlords right now, but we're just encouraging them to work with their tenants to reach agreements, that work. Small businesses. I mean, I personally receive a lot of emails and calls from small business owners, and these stories are so hard to hear. They are really getting killed right now. And, I've been out there a lot talking about PPP, the program that really hasn't worked the way it should to get small businesses the help that they need. I've had a lot of conversations with banks as well, and they've been frustrated because they just didn't get the guidance, initially on how to work through this. And it's a well-intended program, but they have got to make some serious improvements right now in the next round of funding, because right now it's structured that small businesses are supposed to spend like 75% of that funding on keeping their employees employed, and then they have a relatively short window to pay that back. The fact of the matter is, people's employees, they're better off collecting unemployment right now. It's very hard to get them back. And these small businesses both need easier ways to access funding, so that it's not going to just, you've heard the reports about some of this going to publicly traded companies. Our small businesses truly need the help, and they also need more flexibility in paying stuff back. We got 122,000 small businesses in Massachusetts. So behind each of those is an owner and employees, and behind those, of course, are families. So really important. Worked with Ropes and Gray, who's built a coalition of law firms to actually assist small businesses in navigating some of this stuff. I also established a grant program using some funds, leftover settlement funds from the 2008-2009 subprime meltdown, to make available to gateway cities if they wanted to create a small business fund like Boston did. We kicked in some money for that, and we can kick in some more for anybody else who wants to do it. Insurance, pretty big area. We've called on, my insurance team called on insurers to lower auto insurance rates, lower workers' compensation premiums. We've called on the DOI to do that. It's been nice to see some insurers do that anyways, voluntarily, refund rebates and the like, but a lot of work in that space. Nursing homes, half the deaths in Massachusetts, more than, have been in nursing homes. So I've got active investigations against several nursing homes right now. I have a lot of sympathy for the staff and some of the management in these homes too, because they clearly were overwhelmed and not prepared, didn't have access to the PPE that they needed. And so this has been really, really devastating. Probably the most prominent investigation is the one against the Holyoke Soldiers Home, where there's serious issues there. We released a report on the environment and basically, released this brief that we prepared that showed the link between bad air quality, air pollution, and bad public health. And, it basically mapped and showed in all of our environmental justice communities, it's, you see the disparate impact on communities of color. And so it's an interesting brief we put out on that. So, those are some of the things we've done. Bill, you asked about some things that are different. And, a couple things, I found myself panicking in early March about this, because you saw what was happening. And I personally reached out to some infectious disease doctors and public health experts. We're so lucky here in Massachusetts because we have people who are, have led previous efforts to address similar issues. You think about Eric Lander and his leadership of the H1N1 crisis under the Obama administration. So many people, across our wonderful institutions who have been involved in preventing the collapse of whole healthcare systems and dealing with disease and pandemics. So I started to listen to them, and I got really concerned. And, I also reached out to a lot of the hospitals because I wanted to make sure, I mean, they're really front lines, and did they have the PPE? Did they have what they needed? Were things being built out for post-acute care and the like? And, you know, a lot of this was just organization. And, you know, one night I texted the governor, it was a Sunday night, and I said, can we convene a call with our hospital execs tomorrow, and you, me, and the Secretary Sutters and Mayor Walsh, and let's just get on the same page. And that call's been going on about 8 weeks now, and been really, really helpful, I think, because we're we're talking real time, getting updates about, you know, initially it was about how many ventilators, who needs what, to, you know, some of the bigger picture issues around access to testing and, you know, labs and the like. We also got our healthcare team really involved in, Mary Beckman in particular, getting telemedicine through. That's important and is here to stay. I had to reach out to AGs in other states so that, you know, they could get telemedicine licensing to do that in those states, which has proven really important. And finally, I think listening to, you know, obviously we spend a lot of time with public safety, and, you know, we have to, you know, we're talking regularly to the nurses and the firefighters and police. And one of the things that became clear is that, you know, EMS, police, fire, they were scared to death. You know, I got a report that firefighters had responded to a house, and I think it was Westford, and, you know, COVID positive. And then it turned out everybody in the household was COVID positive. And, you know, the firefighters and EMS did not have the equipment that they needed, had to quarantine for 14 days, and, you know, a real nightmare. So we set up this website, which I hope people check out. It's called frontlinema.org. And it's a really cool website. We did not use the state website to build it. We actually reached out to HubSpot and IDEO, and in the matter of 4 days, our team had worked with them and built a website that's really cool. If you're a first responder, you can go, excuse me, if you're a frontline worker, you know, and you need information about how to access PPE, or you're looking for housing, you know, we've got nurses and doctors and EMS who they don't want to go home at night in between shifts and risk infecting their family. And so, you know, you could go on our site and you could see all the hotels that we reached out to and partnered up with to make housing available. Same with meals, you know, a lot of restaurants, there's a lot of programs where, you know, people can get free or discounted meals. And then working with the team at MGH, we also included a whole section on self-care. You know, people are experiencing really traumatic events right now. And, you know, there's a lot of tools and everything from meditation, mindfulness to other things that these folks can access. And then finally, you know, the last cool part about that is that we created a whole side that is for the public, where the public can go on and post on our heroes wall. You know, you see pictures of kids who've made posters saying thank you to our frontline workers. There are also some really great and moving videos of reports from the front line. You know, and it's been really helpful. You know, another aspect was childcare. If you know, for example, there's a nurse right now who lives in the South Shore and works in a major Boston hospital and needs access to childcare, and she got in touch with us through that site, and you know, she's got the emergency childcare that she needs right now. So it's been interesting, and I really credit my team that's always been very outward facing to really engage and think about how we can, you know, deliver real time to people in need. But check out frontlinema.org, see what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you for that. Before I continue, I want to welcome J.D. Chesloff and Chris Healy from the Mass Business Roundtable, and AG. I sit on that board, and members of the roundtable, we joined together, and they're on the call as well. Bob Rivers,
Great.
our chairman, and others. So they're on the call as well.
Oh, terrific.
I started without doing. I apologize for that, but
well,
welcome to.
Yeah, I want to give a couple of shout outs, and first to Bob Rivers, who, you know, I talked about the PPP program, and, I learned a lot talking from him, and our team did, about just some of the problems with what's happening. And I really credit him too with, sounding the alarm on a better program, a better way to make sure that minority business owners in particular were better served by this program. So, he's been out there championing equity, and really, really appreciate Bob's leadership on this. And to JD, Chris, and other business leaders, some of you may remember in the very, very early days in March when myself and my chief deputy, Joanna Lidgate, were calling folks. So weekend we called Bobby Coughlin, right, at Mass Bio, and Brian Johnson at Mass Medic to say, like, what can we do with the companies here so that we can get some PPE? Who's got what? Because this was before things hit, but that later, actually, those early collaborations that weekend and those discussions really materialized into, I got in touch, I called Mike Keneally actually and said, you should be involved in this. And then, the administration adopted this manufacturing response team where, now you see it's more formalized, and a lot of companies have come forward, New Balance, Brooks Brothers, Converse, Nike, literally retooled so that they're making the PPE that we need to make here. So I just really want to thank the business community, because you guys have been so key in helping the state through this. And in fact, in many ways been ahead, in driving action.
Well, you mentioned Bob Coughlin in the biotech. We had a conversation with Secretary Sutter's Bob Coughlin and Dr. Mike Collins from UMass Medical about 2 weeks ago, and it was about the life sciences and finding, in terms of the vaccines and the therapies and the treatment, trying to look at the healthcare part. A lot of the discussions have been about the economy, and folks said, unless you get the healthcare under control, the therapies and the vaccines, the economy may be, stunted for a while. So we had a good conversation. What came out of that, and this may be in your jurisdiction, I know it'll be in your interest, was we need vaccines, we need therapies, but we can't rush to those. We cannot rush. We have to get it right, was one of the exact quotes, I think, of Dr. Collins. And since then, there's been all kinds of articles about that. I know you have an interest, of course, but going forward on therapies and vaccines as the Massachusetts companies, do you have any role in that, or have anything that you envision being engaged with those companies?
Yeah, I mean, we talked to Moderna early on. Initially, it was about, making sure that we were working with local police, that their facilities were safe, because they were literally concerned about anti-vaxxers. I think, we've had a lot of discussions, and, the fact of the matter is it's 1 in 5 jobs here in the state are in the healthcare sector. So it is very much tied to the well-being of our economy. And we are going to have to really rethink and think hard about how we shore up that health system ecosystem, because so much is dependent upon that. So as you can imagine, my antitrust team got involved initially. We wanted to waive any antitrust concerns that hospitals had. We wanted them to be able to collaborate. We wanted them to be able to come together and procure PPE or pursue different strategies. I think, my team will continue to stay involved. We're really mindful. I'm particularly concerned about the financial health. As you see these hospitals bleeding, some instances hundreds of millions each quarter, say nothing of what the community hospitals are going to be dealing with. We're going to have to do a lot of work as a state to make sure that we come out of this. And we're going to come out of this in a way, I think, that where healthcare looks different. I mentioned telemedicine. I think we're going to have to really continue to be involved as an office on that.
Well, thank you. A number of our institutions have been engaged and have really come to the forefront during the COVID-19 crisis. And I'd like to talk about a few of those. Particularly, you talked about student travel, student trips. Front page of the Globe today, it talks about, Boston College planning to come back in the fall. Notre Dame announced yesterday that it's coming back in August. And within the article in the Globe, there's an article about Boston University with a shortfall. I know you've been involved since you've been the Attorney General about higher education, the for-profit institutions, and then the recent legislation on the financial stability of the private colleges. And some private colleges, do not have large endowments. How is your office looking at the higher education landscape? I don't know what I would do if I was a family or a college student who was going back to school in September and going just virtual and not going on campus. I don't know what I would do. Would I take a gap year? Would I pay the money? Would I take the loan? So could you talk about the higher education institutions and how you're looking at that and what your concerns might be?
Yeah, I think it's a really hard call, for these institutions. And, I do want to say many of them have stepped up to provide housing and donate PPE from some of their labs, for example, and that's been really appreciated. But this is a really tough situation. And, our charities team has already, taken some calls from schools that, are really concerned about going under. And, that's real. Answering questions about whether schools can dip into endowments, right? So this is hard, and thinking about how they safely manage any on-campus activities. That's something that I know they're thinking very hard about. I think that they're going to need substantial support too under the CARES Act. It seems like each school is making their own call. I think Northeastern is going to have people back on campus. Others have just said no. But I certainly would want to make sure that, and I know they're doing this. I mean, we want, if people are paying tuition and paying for something, we want them to be getting their money's worth in terms of a learning experience, albeit different learning experience. But, again, higher ed is one of those economic drivers here in our state. So there's a lot on the line for these institutions and for our economy as a result.
Well, I've heard the Roundtable hosted a conference, and a professor from UMass Dartmouth, Professor Goodman, talked, and he talked about how two important sectors, healthcare and higher education, which are experiencing some financial difficulties during this time. Healthcare, the loss of elective surgeries and income, and higher ed, as we just discussed. The impact of those two sectors is critical, as you just said, to our economy, and so that's why I think they're so important. Are you getting any particular kind of calls or concerns from the higher ed world, from the families of the students?
Yeah, I mean, they want to know if they're going to get, they want to know if they should pay tuition, if they're going to get their money back, if they, I think they're, some of these schools had trips overseas, kids taking semesters this semester to go overseas or this quarter. So there's been some of that, but I think, I think our office needs to be part of the conversation and needs to try to, help and support these institutions as we as a state work through this issue. And so we're listening, we're trying to understand, where people are coming from. But it's complicated, and I think it really requires a whole lot of stakeholder participation on this one.
Yeah, I was surprised that an institution like Boston University, with in the front page of the Globe, it says 70 million to 150 million shortfall, and not contributing to its retirement fund. That's an institution that I would say was financially strong. I know they have a lot of foreign students that come in, and I know a lot of our colleges do. Suffolk, I know, does, and a lot of others, and that must be very impactful for those students and for those institutions.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, the numbers are incredible. I mean, the number of foreign students, both undergrad, as a general matter, particularly with our Boston schools, but also our graduate schools, and it's had a real impact.
that legislation that you supported last year or a year and a half ago, does that help now during this time?
You're talking about what happens when colleges and universities start to go under, and
Yes.
the monitoring of that by higher ed. I
Yes.
think that was a precursor, right, to some of what we're seeing today. I mean, this isn't the first time that institutions have been facing these issues. We've got a lot of institutions in the state. So I think having, that's an infrastructure where conversations can take place. I think that should continue. Because maybe that helps us better. I've said, I'd rather know, if you're having trouble. It's easier to deal with that on the front end than on the back end when, you abruptly have to close, and then there are a bunch of students who are out of luck and families that are really upset, and, it's sort of hard to deal with it at that point. So that's what I've encouraged.
Thank you. The nonprofit institutions, aside from higher ed, your concern about, we've read a lot of articles about the fundraising efforts. I'm not asking about that per se, but a lot of these nonprofit institutions are struggling now. A lot of them had their fundraisers canceled and postponed. A lot of them are on the edge anyway. Are there any concerns you're hearing about the stability of the nonprofit institutions that report to your office?
Yeah, I think there's huge instability and insecurity, and this is a really tough time. Our nonprofits and charities have been overwhelmed. They need help. So we recently issued guidance, specifically guidance on endowments for charities that were facing financial challenges. And I commend people to that guidance. But get in touch with us, talk to us. I certainly encourage people to continue giving. We of course put out guidance around giving wisely, but giving and finding ways to support these institutions right now, because they are under considerable strain and will be.
Thank you. I know you've talked about the healthcare institutions and the impact that this has had on the community hospitals. Many were struggling before it. The larger providers. How do you see these institutions doing now? Particularly you've talked about some of the larger places, particularly on the community hospital level that serve some of the other cities and towns throughout the Commonwealth, not just downtown Boston.
I think it's a real issue for so many of our community hospitals. For the AMCs, I think it is, they're just better resourced and positioned to weather this. But, our DISH hospitals, community hospitals will need certainly federal funding. And I think we need to think about, state funding as well. It's going to be hard. And, we've had some conversations because there are some hospitals that have converted some units over to and closed, maternity wards, for example, and converted over to COVID only. We've said to them, we expect you to reopen those units immediately after this. But I think it's going to be really, really tough. And, again, it's not only the community hospitals too. I mean, we're getting reports. There's a lot of physicians groups that, have been struggling as a result. So, my team and my healthcare team will continue to be active in listening and trying to think through, solutions to some of this.
Well, the sad news is that some people who need care, non-COVID related, have not sought it, which is sad that they may need attention but have not reached out for it. Either they don't want to go to the doctors or they don't want to go to the hospitals. And then, of course, the elective surgeries at one time were all postponed, and therefore that kind of service was not provided. That may start returning now, as the certain facilities, as you said, that were used for COVID now go back to regular use.
Yeah, it's, and now with this attestation process, I mean, I think it is important that hospitals be allowed to reopen for elective surgeries. This goes right to their cash flow. I don't want to see more people laid off or furloughed, but, they need the money coming in. And a lot of that's going to come through getting back to elective surgeries.
Yeah. Next question is, since you've been Attorney General, you've been very committed to the opioid crisis, and you provided education, services. You've been involved in mental health and behavioral problems. Have you seen, or do you foresee COVID-19 impacting these people in need of treatment and service? And if we made any progress on the opioid crisis, are you concerned about going backwards? Not to the numbers that we had, the number of deaths and suicides, but the number of opioid-related cases. Could you talk about what you're seeing and what your office may be doing on that? I know it's a special initiative that you've been engaged in since you've been the AG.
Yeah. Well, I guess, some of the big picture stuff, our cases against Purdue, the Sackler family, continue. We're very involved in discussions with other AGs and other drug manufacturers and distributors. So that work is really continuing. But, I am concerned. People continue to use. It's been harder for our drug trafficking enforcement teams to do some of the work, which really has been focused on breaking down some of the cartels and the bigger distribution networks. But, we can't use CIs right now. It's kind of a hard situation in terms of for law enforcement. I look at BMC, they, together with partners, setting up, Boston Hope over there with the mayor's office. The substantial amount of time was focused on connecting with the homeless population. I happened to be driving by Melnia Cass the other night, and again, I see a ton of people out there. Not as many, but a significant number of people. Of course, without masks and congregating closely. And I think that is going to, as we move through the summer, we have to really watch closely what's happening there. But no doubt, this crisis has taken away. It has to have taken away, support services for people who are suffering from the opioid crisis. So, we've got to do as much as we can to make sure that we address those needs. But it's hard. It's certainly hard. I don't think we've seen an increase in the number of opioid overdoses or deaths. I asked, I was talking to a police officer the other day what he was seeing, and they're not seeing an increase in calls, but the problem certainly hasn't gone away. And I think, look, I've been talking about behavioral health needs for a long time. We really need to do everything we can to make sure that access to treatment and behavioral health services remain, a priority. We were really pushing hard on that, and we've got to continue to push hard on that, because I think that's the key to so much right now in terms of what's ailing people.
Well, there's been a number of stories about folks with behavioral health and mental health issues, and what is the impact on them particularly. We all feel isolated in some way, not being in our normal routines, and for those folks, it must be heightened by that isolation and not being engaged and so forth. So.
Yeah, I know that groups like Joanne Peterson, Learn to Cope, groups are continuing to meet. AA, they're doing, a lot of virtual stuff. It's good, but it's, underlying treatment and services, big needs remain.
Yeah. My next question, on the end of that, on the line, we do have folks from Pine Street Inn, where I'm engaged in, Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, and you are right. They are on the phone about the demand. At the convention center, of course, Boston Healthcare for the Homeless is there. There's a new engagement center down there on Mass Ave. So they talk about the particular impacts at a place like Pine Street Inn. You can imagine how they test and how they take care of those folks in those physical conditions.
Yeah, and kudos to them. They've been doing amazing work both in guiding the city and the state on issues. And, we just really need to be there for them because they're having to really weather a lot. Particularly, I mean, think about homelessness and what's happening with the economy right now and people out of work and, what that gives rise to in terms of homelessness.
Yeah.
We've got to stay focused on that.
In terms of your work in the National Association of Attorneys General, the association, could you talk about how you've worked with your fellow attorneys general in response to COVID-19? Has there been a lot of collaborative work between the different
Yeah,
states?
Yeah, I think, we talked a little bit about the small business issue and PPP. Our office recently led a group of AGs on a letter to Congress to point out some of the issues with that. We spent a lot of time advocating for health and safety of workers in the workplace. Some of it's been of more notoriety, or raising the issue with Amazon and Whole Foods. I think many of us do view our job as making sure that, workplace safety and protections are at the forefront, particularly as we move towards reopening now, because it's not just about protecting workers, which is important, but also, customers coming in and out. We're continuing to defend the Affordable Care Act. Many of us, fight brought by Republican AGs, unfortunately, that is going forward. And then, I think that those are the main things. I think many of us have also spent time focused on the issue of domestic violence. My office recently put out a number of resources on domestic violence because DV reports are down, and it's no surprise when people are quarantined at home with their abusers. And so we did some innovative things like create flyers to put up in laundromats and grocery stores where hopefully we can better reach people and let them know the SafeLink hotline number and let them know that resources are available.
Has there been an increase in domestic cases?
No, I mean, that's part of the concern is that people are, stuck at home with their abuser. They're not able to use the phone. They're not able to, go online and so reports have gone down. I think we're starting to see some more reports with the heightened stress, anxiety, things just inevitably blow over. So we've seen some, in some communities reports go up, but I think the concern, Bill, is like, we're seeing underreporting and domestic violence hasn't stopped. And in fact, given the stress, anxiety, people losing jobs, people at home, the concern is it's only increased in terms of incidents. And I think long term, when it comes to DV, one thing we've really got to work on as a state, our shelters are full. They've been full for a long time. There's overflow right now of women and children in some hotels, but we got to figure out a better system going forward to get more stable long-term housing in place for these survivors and their kids.
I have a last question before we have you close. In terms of going forward, how do you sort of gear up? That's the phrase I'm using. Gear up your office for the new normal that we're going to experience. And I'd like to tie that question into what are your concerns about reopening as we start to reopen the economy? I'd like you to address that as the last question and then give you a chance to make some closing remarks.
Great. For us, we've been open, so I'm not really. We've had conversations as a team about physically what does that look like to bring more people back to our office. And I think like many employers, you're thinking about the various conditions that you've got to have in place. And my philosophy is probably to keep as many people home as long as possible because, productivity is still high and they're just safer there. And, that's kind of what I think about in terms of reopening. As a general matter, reopening, I think we have to focus on the reality that employers really want to get people back to work. I totally get that. I want to make sure, though, that people aren't bullied into work in certain instances. I've already gotten some reports about threats by some employers to, the people have got to come back to work, people who may even be particularly vulnerable and sick. And, I think those instances hopefully are going to be far and few between, but as an office, we're going to be focused on making sure that workers are protected as we move forward, particularly low-income workers and hourly workers. I'm also really concerned about nursing homes. I still don't quite know all of what happened there, and we're trying to get to the bottom of this, but obviously I think our long-term care facilities, it's an opportunity to look as we go forward. We don't want to have any let up there. And I think that this crisis has exposed and exacerbated the underlying disparities. We've seen that in its impact on Black and Brown communities. And, we cannot just go back to a world where those inequities exist or allowed to exist. And so those are some of the things that, I think about as we reopen. I also think it's a hard position for the governor. No matter what he does, he's going to be critiqued. And I think it's a hard balancing act. And, it requires a little bit of give on everyone's part as we try to balance these things. And people, we've got to stay nimble and we've got to stay flexible, and give everybody the benefit of the doubt on this, because it's, it's hard. But certainly I think we all share an interest in seeing things going again. But what that looks like, we'll see.
Well, we had a webinar yesterday on returning to work, and many of the questions that came from the audience was about, what about if workers don't feel safe? What about if they have special conditions, they don't want to go back? What can the employer do? So I anticipate there'll be many questions and concerns about the health and safety in the workplace.
Yeah, so we're going to update an FAQ that we have for employers to try to address some of those questions. And I just encourage people, call Cindy, Mark, and Heather Rowe on my team to try to, if you want to have you or your legal team reach out on some of that stuff.
Well, Attorney General Healey, we are very grateful for you being with us today. And if you'd just like to make a few closing remarks, and I know you have another appointment, and we appreciate your time and today. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the time. And, as I say, this has been a time where you've seen a lot of sadness and devastation, but you've seen a lot of heart and compassion, and I'll close with just a couple of instances. As I mentioned before, my community engagement team has really been out there trying to connect with low-income communities and communities of color. And we put together and distributed tens of thousands of flyers in 10 different languages in hotspot communities and targeted communities of color and immigrant communities around the state. And a couple weeks ago, I had a chance to go to the Everett Grace Food Pantry in Everett, and also the Chelsea Collaborative in Chelsea to hand out some of these flyers and to just take in and see, the lines and the profound need out there. And, I'm heartened that we can come together and find ways to support communities. But there's certainly a lot of people in desperate need of help. But, I was proud of my team for having the foresight to get that information out there, get it in languages, get it distributed, put it in packets that were going out all over the state. And that was really heartening. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we've actually had people in our law office who've lost loved ones to this. And, this was a nice story in my view. The chief of our major crimes division, she lost her mother-in-law in a nursing home. And, she came back a few days later and she said, we have been visiting her for years. And one of the hardest things was to not be able to visit with her, to not be able to see her, or really even, talk with her. And she said, could we ever figure out a way to get tablets to anybody in a nursing home who wants to connect? And, we then worked and reached out, Amazon, Walmart, Acer, different companies all stepped up. We've got 1,000 tablets out there distributed to residents. And, they're better able to stay in touch with family and friends. And maybe this becomes a permanent built-in, part of the way we do things. So I just share that as, an instance of somebody taking tragedy and turning it into something positive. And I think that's my overall gloss for this, that, we find a way to turn this pandemic into something where we create a better, healthier, and more equitable, community state for all.
One point that's coming up a lot in my conversations with people is about how we have to have hope going forward. And do we have hope? How do we have it in this adversity? So that's something that I know we're all thinking about going forward.
Yeah. Hey, there's a lot to be hopeful about. Look at all the innovation. Look at how we've leapfrogged, from the way we've worked, the way we work and communicate with each other, stepping on the gas when it comes to some of the life sciences and biotech stuff and vaccines. So yeah, there's a lot to be hopeful about. And there's a lot, that people are waking up to and realizing too about the fragility of aspects of our economy and, our country. But let's absolutely be hopeful. And there's no better place to have more hope than in this Commonwealth, that's for sure, given what we have to offer from the business community to not-for-profits to our colleges and research institutions. And, I'd like to say a number of folks in government that are trying to do some good too.
Well, thank you, Attorney General Healey. Thanks to everybody on the call. Thanks to the folks on the round table. And I'm grateful for all my partners and staff at Nutter for their support. Thank you all very much, and I hope you and your families all remain well. Thank you, Attorney General. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Always great.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
So long now. Thanks.